As we saw in the last two videos, that we can create these endless varieties of these really organic looking papers. But in the process of doing that, we're actually going to create some extra papers that we don't really necessarily need. And in order to get rid of those, we need to go back to our paper libraries, select the paper that you want to get rid of by clicking on it. And then you see over here there's a little trash can. Just click on that and that will delete paper. It'll ask you first if you're sure you want to delete it, and you just say OK, and it's deleted. Now, that is not necessarily just deleted out of your document, it's also deleted out of your entire workspace. So that's something to bear in mind when you're thinking about, well, do I need to keep these papers or what? Now, one of the things that I've been talking about a lot as we're working here, and I'll just delete this other one while we're here because we don't need that one either. One of the things I've been talking about a lot when we're talking about papers, I've been mentioning the term paper grain. And hopefully that's raised some awareness in your own mind of what exactly it is that a paper is doing. It's giving the brush the ability to interact with grain. And if you notice at the top here, at this top bar that we have a grain option. Now, we won't have this with every brush, but for any brush that will interact with these papers, there'll be a grain option that we can change the value of. So let me just go ahead and use the space bar to move over a little bit here. And I'll just start with our Fractal 1 paper, and I'm going to increase the grain value all the way up to 100, and I'm going to click, like so. And now I'm going to decrease the grain all the way down to something like 0, and I'm going to click again. Now you can see with this particular brush, we're not getting any result at all, because if it's not picking up any grain, it's not depositing any pigment. So if we go and do something like, say, 10, and then we click, still not getting anything. Let's go do something like, say, 50. There we go. So now we're getting a very, very light mark, a very faint mark. That's due to the fact that the way that this brush is set up is it only will deposit pigment if there is a significant amount of paper grain. Now this would be very different if we're using a different paper grain. So let me change to different paper grain, and you can see with that grain value of 50, this particular paper grain is depositing quite a lot of pigment. This one here would probably deposit a fair amount of pigment, whereas say something like this coarse cotton duck, not going to deposit as much pigment. Now, how do we understand which is going to deposit a lot and which isn't? If you notice, the ones that I picked first two are darker, and the overall darkness means that you're going to have overall more pigment deposited, whereas if we choose a paper that's fairly light, then we're going to get less pigment deposited. So in those instances, if we're not happy with what we're getting from that paper, this would be a time where increasing the paper grain will give us more coverage of that pigment into the grain, even though it's a lighter paper. So we don't necessarily always need to come over here and adjust the brightness contrast in order to get a different brush stroke. We can also adjust the grain value, which is sort of a global slider, to indicate how much of any given paper grain the brush is going to interact with. But of course, that's going to be very different depending upon the paper that you're working with. So you want to work here and think about working with, whichever paper you're actually choosing. You want to work here in terms of getting your paper set up, and remember to always turn on that directional toggle whenever you're judging a paper. But then also bear in mind that by reducing the grain amount to say something really low, like say 25, with this paper grain, it's not going to give us much of anything, as you can see. However, if we were to switch to, say, this paper grain, and I'll turn on the directional toggle, you'll see that at 25, we're still getting something, even though that was too low to be useful at the other settings. So with this paper grain, maybe something like 40 might be enough. So there we go. That's just something to be aware of. And when you're thinking about how to work with papers, always bear in mind that that grain slider is going to have a huge, huge impact.